Welcome once again to my choice of the 12 best games of chess ever played. With me is the celebrated author and journalist Donald Woods. Welcome, Donald. Who will be joining me later to comment on this week's game. Last week we profiled the great Boris Spassky and promised you an in-depth look at the Fischer-Spassky match of Reykjavik 1972. A major landmark in chess history, attracting more media coverage than any previous chess match anywhere. The reason, of course, was the presence of Bobby Fischer, one of the most controversial figures in the history of chess. Bobby Fischer was born in Brooklyn in 1943. His rise to the top was meteoric, marking him out as one of the supreme chess prodigies of all time. By the age of 15, he was a world championship candidate. But his first two attempts at the chess crown, in 1959 and 1962, foundered when he went down to the legions of Russian grandmasters in the candidates' tournaments. Then, in 1970, Fischer's fortune changed. The qualifying cycle for the World Championship had been switched from a tournament to a match system, and Fischer powered his way through to a challenge against Spassky by demolishing Taimanov, Larsen and Petrosyan, beating the first two by an astounding 6-0 win. Then came the grand climax, the match in Reykjavik 1972 against Boris Spassky. Inevitably, a clash between representatives of Russian and American might became overladen with symbolic and political overtones, which attracted the glare of the world media. This glare was fueled by Fischer's strange series of antics, and the match was characterized by the Americans' detailed demands and his near refusal to play before the match was even underway. The game I have chosen was instrumental in deciding the outcome of the 1972 World Championship match. So, Donald, Fischer played white, Spassky black, and Fischer kicked off with the move c4, the English opening. But as we'll soon see, there was a rapid transposition to our old friend. Here it comes.
Queen's Gambit.
Queen's Gambit, that's right. Knight f6, knight c3, and Spassky played bishop e7, the tried and tested orthodox defence to the Queen's Gambit, which of course we saw as well in the game between Bernstein and Capablanca,
right,
from Moscow 1914. Spassky castled his king into safety, and Fischer played this move, bringing out his bishop, and now Spassky attacked the bishop. And in many games between Kasparov and Karpov, we now see the move bishop takes knight on f6. It's the modern try, the latest try in this position to give white an advantage.
I'm glad to hear that, Ray, because I'd zap that knight every time, but I noticed in most cases it seems to be the bishop goes to h4 and then g3.
That's right, that's what happened in this game. Fischer dropped the bishop back, and of course, as you say, Donald, the bishop could go to g3 to menace the black queen's wing, or it can stay on h4, and perhaps at a later stage, a more opportune moment, he can play bishop takes knight on f6. Well, now Spassky played this move. It's called, and this is a mouthful, the Tartakova-Merkoganov-Bondarevsky variation. I'll repeat that, Tartakova-Merkoganov-Bondarevsky.
It's magnificent.
And Bondarevsky was one of Spassky's trainers, and he picked it up from the two older masters, Tartakova and Merkoganov. And it's one of black's most solid defences in the Queen's Gambit. In fact, there's an ongoing debate as to how white should properly react against this. How does white get an advantage? For example, this move has been seen against it. Some people play the bishop to e2. Some people put the queen on b3. And yet again, others have been known to play bishop takes f6 now, once black's committed himself to the pawn move on the queen side. But in 1972, the fashionable move was to take this pawn off. And now we see the point of black's defence. He can take back with the knight on d5. And this alleviates a lot of his cramp, a lot of his development difficulties. The exchanges help to free the black position. And now Fischer could play the bishop back to g3, it's possible, but then there could be an annoying pin like this. So he doesn't do that. he trades bishops on e7. And Capablanca once had this position, and he took with the knight. But it's a little bit passive. There's no need to do that. It's better to keep the knight on d5.
Take with the queen.
Yes, exactly. The main line is to take on e7 with the queen. And now Fischer decides to fix the central pawn formation. He trades knights. Black must take back. And now a key move, rook across to c1. And you'll see, Donald, that the black pawn on c7 is a weakness. Not a serious weakness yet, it's a potential weakness. It's a backward pawn on an open file. And if white can gang up on this pawn, perhaps with moves like queen c2, he's going to get the advantage. So black has to take measures against this. Now, let me ask you an unfair question.
Shoot. Ask away.
It's black's move. He should move his bishop. He should develop the bishop. Where would you put it?
I'd fianchetto.
You put
And
it...
even as I say it, I'm guessing that that's probably not what happened.
Yeah, it's the natural move, because you play b6, you expect he who says b6 must say bishop b7.
Yes.
But in fact, on b7, you'll see it on the diagram now, the pawn on d5 restricts the bishop.
Yes.
Given the chance, black plays better bishop e6.
e6, yeah.
The pawn on d5 still restricts the bishop, but at least it has chances later on perhaps to go to f5 or even g4
Yes.
with more active counterplay.
I'll bear that in mind next time, right?
And now we see a very nice move by Fischer. Queen out to a4. And the threat of this move, apart from the general pressure that it puts on the black queen side, the strain it imposes on the black pieces in that area, it's
yes.
supporting this move precisely. It's supporting the move b2 to b4, which puts a clamp on the black pawn in the c file. The pawn on b4, the pawn on d4 are like twin horns squeezing black in and making it impossible for him ever to free his game by playing a move like c5.
Ray, this is the sort of thing I notice about Bobby Fischer's play as far as ordinary players like myself are concerned. There's such a beautiful simplicity to it. That's probably not the right word, but it's an apparent simplicity. And I'm aware, as I say that to people of your level, you can see deeper profundities in his play, which are not apparent to us. But is it not true that Bobby Fischer's play is characterized by, it's the simplicity of a Bach fugue? Once you hear it, you think, well, the notes couldn't have gone anywhere else. And that's what his play always looks like to me.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. It looks, when Fischer's playing, that each move is dreadfully simple.
Yes.
And yet these simple moves add up to a cumulative crushing effect. And Queen a4 is a fairly unpretentious move, but it has a much deeper point, as we'll see in a minute. And what Spassky plays quite reasonably is pawn to c5. And you'll remember, Donald, in the Bernstein-Capablanca game we saw a few weeks ago, that when Capablanca achieved this move c5, I said, well, his position's liberated, his problems are over, and the game is equal. But here, because of Fischer's subtle play, this isn't quite the case. Even after this liberating thrust, the positions still aren't quite level. And now we see really the subtle hidden point behind the move queen to a4, this move that looked like just a sort of general pressing move on the queen side with the fairly transparent threat of playing the pawn from b2 to b4. What he does is he puts the queen back on a3.
What I call a sassy pin.
A sassy pin.
Yes.
And this is a dreadfully important move because the queen on a3 exerts a baleful influence right through the black position from a3 down to f8. The pawn on c5 is, of course, pinned. It can't take on d4. The black queen on e7 hangs. And there's now tremendous pressure against the pawn on c5. Now, black could play his knight to d7 to diffuse this, but then white plays bishop b5, increasing the pressure and also threatening in some circumstances just to lop off the knight.
That's what I would have done.
So, knight d7 doesn't really solve the problem.
The reason I would have done that, and I think, again, most club players, is we've got this fixation about getting your rooks connected, almost to a fault.
Yeah.
And therefore get that knight off there, get him working in another direction.
Spassky played better. He played this rook c8. And Fischer now played another very subtle move, bishop b5. Of course, it's natural when the black knight's on d7. It's not so natural
Yes.
when the knight isn't there yet. And now, Spassky makes his first mistake. He plays a6. Now this has a kind of threat against the white bishop, but it's not a serious threat.
Can't
if he takes
take
the
it,
bishop,
yes.
it's pinned to the rook.
Yes.
The queen pins the pawn to the rook. After a year of intensive analysis, the Soviet analytical machine discovered that the right move in this position is queen to b7, simply sacrificing the pawn on c5. And they discovered that after the pawn is taken, after the sacrifice, black gets sufficient compensation and can make a draw. But
Well, if it took them a year, it wouldn't take a short match like that.
That's right. I mean, it took their best brains a year to find this, and of course poor Spassky had to confront this problem over the board. And it's not surprising that he makes an inferior move, a natural move, but an inferior one. And Fischer takes off. Spassky has to take back, and Fischer castles. And now rook a7. And what he's trying to do is to defend the rook. The queen on e7 now defends the rook on a7.
Oh, so he can, yes.
So the threat of a takes b5
Yes.
becomes real.
Right.
Fischer has to move his bishop away. He moves it back to e2. And at last the knight is developed. But now Fischer has a wonderful move. He plays knight to d4.
Yeah.
And of course it can't be taken. If pawn takes knight,
Zap.
then you take
Yes.
the black queen. Queen takes
Yeah.
queen on e7. That's clear. Spassky moved his queen back to defend it. But now we see the point of Fischer's very fine play. He takes off the bishop on the e6 square, and Spassky takes back. Now it looks as if, perhaps, black is okay here. He's got quite a solid pawn centre. His pieces are fairly well coordinated. But white has two important advantages. One is the bishop on e2 is superior to the knight in an open position. It's infinitesimally superior. The advantage is minute, but a minute advantage in Fischer's hands can be a mighty bludgeon in the later part of the game. The other advantage white has is he has two sets of pawns, two pawn islands, one set on the queen side, one set on the king side. Black has three islands of pawns, the king side, the centre and the queen side. And this split formation is a disadvantage, and Fischer exposes both of these in magnificent fashion. And first of all, he punches a hole in the centre. He offers a pawn sacrifice. Black could take it, but then his position's a terrible wreck. Pawns are scattered everywhere. It's as if a hurricane's blown through his position. And white would get the pawn back very quickly anyway. He would simply attack the pawn on e4, and it would fall very soon. Black can't consider that. Spassky sensibly played his pawn on to d4. And that actually creates a protected passed pawn in the middle of the board, which is quite a considerable plus. The trouble is Spassky can never push the pawn any further. The white bishop on e2 and white's general control of the light squares, Donald, is stopping that pawn ever from advancing. So it's a somewhat negative trump.
And e6 is starting to look a bit sick.
Exactly,
isn't it?
exactly. And what Fischer does now, if black could play this move, for example, at no cost to himself and fortify the centre, he might be all right. But Fischer now takes pains to lock in the black e-pawn on e6. He starts to besiege it.
Threat later from the bishop.
That's right.
Yeah. I'm starting to learn, Ray. We must do this more often. You know, I could learn something about this game.
The queen comes up. And now, again, Spassky's threatening to play this, which he couldn't do the previous move, because when white took it, the rook attacked the queen. And just in time, everything's always just in time in Fischer's games. You noticed that, Donald?
Yes.
It's always just in time. He fixes the e-pawn as a weakness. Spassky tries to get counterplay on the open b file. But now the real siege starts. Bishop to c4, attacking the e6 pawn. And the threat, of course, is to push on this pawn, exploiting the pin. So the king steps out of the firing line. And now a wonderful move, beautiful move. The queen sweeps over from one extreme edge of the board to the other. a3 to h3. Double attack against the pawn on e6. There's very little choice. The knight has to go back to f8. And now a little safety move on the queen side, stopping black from taking the pawn with the rook. And now black literally has run out of sensible moves. He's got nothing sensible to do at all. What he did was, he pushed this pawn. Doesn't really have much effect. And Fischer transmuted the advantage of the pressure against e6 by this next very fine move into the advantage of a passed pawn. Spassky can't allow this to happen. He must take it off. Pawn takes pawn. And now up comes the rook. Rook takes. The knight goes into h7, and the other rook comes over. And now the two rooks, the bishop...
He's got four pieces powerfully involved.
That's right. Spassky is really just marking time. Queen to d8. And the queen comes over, preparing to advance the kingside pawns. Rook goes into e7. And up comes this pawn, restricting the black knight. And this move. Really, again, just marking time. And finally, this move, pawn to e6. And this passed pawn on e6 is now like a fishbone rammed into Spassky's throat. All he can do is move round it. He can't really do anything about it at all. And in the wake of the passed pawn, up comes the queen. Queen to e5. Spassky waits. Queen goes to e8. And Fischer locks out the remotest chance of counterplay. Spassky marking time again. Really nothing he can do. And now Fischer marks time a bit himself. This move isn't strictly necessary.
Yes,
F2.
I was wondering why. Why there particularly?
Yes, he's waiting to find the right plan. And then the next move, he finds the right plan and brings the rook up here. There's nothing Spassky can do about this. His pieces are on the best defensive squares. He just has to wait to see what happens. And now the bishop realigns itself, pointing at the black king side. The queen goes back to e8 again. And now queen to e4. And you can see devilish intentions. Absolutely devilish intentions.
Even I can see that.
Yes, and one threat is to put the rook here check. And then after it captures on f8, queen h7 will be made.
Yes.
It's a horrible threat.
Or even f7, surely.
Even f7 as well. He played knight to f6. And now the crowning glory of this wonderful game, this game that's been likened to a Mozart symphony by grandmasters on the spot. He just breaks through the defensive wall by playing rook takes knight on f6. Black must take back. And down come the barricades around the black king. Rook takes f6. King goes to g8. There's really very little he can do. And I think Spassky was very short of time now as well. The bishop goes into c4. He marks time again. And then the final move, after the time control, queen to f4. And really, hopeless position now. White has bishop and pawn for the exchange, for the rook, and black's nothing he can do at all. Spassky resigned in this position.
Brilliant stuff.
For example, if he plays king here, white takes his pawn with the queen, and then he comes here, for example, and then finally, in comes the bishop, check, and black's completely destroyed, absolutely hopeless. And if the rook goes here to stop it, then this is checkmate. Wonderful game.
Powerful that bishop ended up being.
Yes.
There's always the threat. Yeah, a wonderful game.
Right.
But virtually all these games are like that, aren't they?
Yes, it is. Wonderful. Perhaps the Western media exposure helped to knock the stuffing out of Spassky. After 1972, chess enthusiasts witnessed an amazing and unexpectedly permanent decline in his morale. He never staged a comeback and was granted permission to represent Soviet culture abroad by joining his French-born third wife, Marina, in her homeland. Strangely, the 1972 match had an even more disastrous impact in chess terms on its victor. You wouldn't have guessed it at the time, though. This is Fischer being interviewed after his return to the States.
Do you think that in trying to sort of get better facilities, you've been instrumental in getting a record person, this sort of thing? Has it purely been personal gain, or has it really been to upgrade the whole game of chess as far as you're concerned?
It's been basically to upgrade the game, and to make it, I mean, personal gain. I haven't been, if I were interested in personal gain, I wouldn't just be taking up chess.
You'd applied your brain to something else, would you?
Yeah, I would be in the stock market. This is where the personal gain is at.
What do you intend to do now?
I want to keep playing a lot of chess.
Yeah, quite. But what's your next target? Do you think there'll be a return game with Spassky soon, for example?
Definitely, I want to play a return match. It's a question of the money, A, and B, it's a question of will the Russians let Spassky play? And then I guess C, does he want to play me?
The big addition to the purse, the £50,000, came from London, from an Englishman. Is it likely you'd consider playing the return match in England?
It's a possibility. I mean, I wouldn't close the door in any place.
It doesn't worry you particularly where it is.
No, I think the States would be a good place for the next match. Because, believe it or not, I mean, that's where they got the facilities for TV and everything. They do it right without, creating a fuss.
How do you rate Spassky now? I mean, what are the chances, do you think, of your holding on again in a return match with Spassky?
Oh, I think I'll beat him, much more easily. There's no question about it in my mind.
This is really because
I think, I've broken him.
This is what you really set out to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
How would you rate him compared with other players you've played against?
The best, definitely. He gave me a real fight. All the other players I played, they crumbled at a certain stage, and I never felt that, with Spassky.
He never played another competitive game. Donald, would you care to speculate on the reasons for this?
It's one of the great mysteries of the game, isn't it? What makes this genius suddenly abandon chess? I don't know, maybe he felt that having become world champion, he couldn't scale the heights again. Or, on the other hand, you'd imagine that with such a competitive player, he'd want to show how much further he could exceed world championship record performances. I mean, was he not the highest rated player in chess history until Kasparov?
At that time, yes, of course. And in that interview that we just saw, he looked supremely confident and very aggressive.
Yes.
And my personal thinking is that having scaled a chess Everest, as it were, and become world champion and achieved his ambition, he felt that playing any other game of chess under any circumstances would somehow infringe his status, that even if he lost a game or drew a game against Joe Bloggs in a simultaneous display, this would somehow take away from his status as the greatest player ever.
Well, to put it at its gentlest, that is a very peculiar mental attitude and a great loss for the game of chess.
Yes, and of course this is just speculation. I don't really know what the reasons are, but it's...
Did you ever play him, right?
I never played him, no. I watched him play at very close quarters a number of times. And once I shared a lift with him in the Olympics at Havana in 1966. But wouldn't it be marvellous if we could see Fischer come back someday and play against Karpov and Kasparov?
That would be great.
I mean, this is, I think, the dream of every chess player, that this would happen. I just think of the games that Fischer and Kasparov would play.
Be a good challenge for Thames Television.
It would
Get
indeed.
Bobby Fischer back into chess.
Yeah. Anyway, as we now know, in spite of regular attempts to attract him back into tournament chess, Fischer has remained an obstinate recluse. But the beneficiaries of Fischer's success in popularising the game and in raising world title purses to astronomical heights were the two great Russians, Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov. Between them, they dominated the 1980s. Join us next week to see the most important game in their marathon battle for world chessboard supremacy. Till then, it's goodbye from Donald, myself, and the Thames chess team.
Jewels of the Mind was presented in association with Grandmaster Video Magazine.
and welcome to the very last programme in my choice of the 12 best games of chess ever played. I am joined by the eminent editor and author, Donald Woods, who will shortly be assisting me in the game analysis. We'll be looking at an explosive clash between Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov, a game which typifies the battle between two of the greatest figures of contemporary chess, who have spent their careers in a marathon series of confrontations. Karpov learnt to play chess at the age of 4 and won the World Junior Championship in 1969. In 1975, at 24, he became the first man in history to win the World Championship by default. Bobby Fischer's refusal to play astounded the chess world and left the victor with a determination to prove himself worthy of the crown. As champion, Karpov energetically established a record for winning first prizes in tournaments. Korchnoi, one of the very best Soviet grandmasters, had outraged the USSR chess establishment by defecting. In 1978, Karpov narrowly survived Korchnoi's first challenge, but Karpov only survived as champion by the odd point. In 1981, Korchnoi's second challenge was brushed aside with great ease. Karpov's tournament record from 1975 to 1984 was truly remarkable. He won first prize in virtually every tournament he played in. But he met his match in the Azerbaijani Garry Kasparov. The challenger was a product of the Botvinnik school of chess. Kasparov had become a grandmaster at the astonishing age of 17 in 1980, and experts already predicted that he would be even stronger than Fischer. Between 1984 and 1987, Karpov played the almost incredible total of 4 matches against Kasparov for the title. The first match was unique in chess annals in being abandoned unfinished after 5.5 months and 48 games, no less than 40 of them drawn. Controversy still surrounds the decision of Florencio Campomanes, the president of FIDE, to halt the match after Kasparov had just won the 47th and 48th games. The game which decided the second Karpov-Kasparov match in 1985 was superb. Everything hung on this final game. If Karpov won, he stayed as champion. If Kasparov won, he would become the youngest world champion in the history of chess. Watch now as the symbolic and supremely exciting battle of opposing styles unfolds. Karpov was white, and he played e4. And remember, a draw for Kasparov in this game, Donald, would have given him the title. He didn't need to win. So one might have expected perhaps the Caro-Kann defence, c6, which has a reputation for great solidity, or maybe
Anything tight, really.
anything tight like e5 and maybe a Petrov defence. But no, Kasparov has always played the Sicilian defence, the most aggressive counter-attacking defence, and he stayed true to himself and played the Sicilian. And so, in a sense, we have what both players wanted. Karpov's got a sharp fight, and Kasparov has a sharp fight too. But I can't think of anybody else in the whole gamut of chess who would not have chosen a more cautious defence when just needing a half point for the World Championship. Karpov continued with the main line, knight to f3, and Kasparov played this move. This is all mainline theory, well known to both players and played many times before in their matches. Black always takes in the centre here, and white takes back with the knight. And out comes the black knight, hitting the white pawn on e4, and the white knight comes out to defend it. And black plays this. Do you know what this is called, Donald?
No, but I know that it's a consideration of those 2 knights there.
It's called the Najdorf variation.
Oh, Najdorf.
After this
that's the
Polish-
old Argentinian.
That's right,
Yes,
old Argentinian Polish grandmaster Miguel Najdorf, who introduced this little pawn move, a6, into tournament play. But the funny thing about modern chess is that openings tend to blend and mould into each other. And although it's a Najdorf at the moment, after Karpov's next move, bishop e2, Kasparov chose e6, and suddenly, miraculously, we transposed in another variation. This one's called the Scheveningen variation. And this is named after a Dutch seaside resort where there was a tournament in 1923 where everybody was playing this.
That's the one they used to make the suspected German spies pronounce.
That's right,
Yeah,
yes, yes. I would have been caught as a German spy, because I can't pronounce it.
Well, thanks to Afrikaans, I might have managed. Scheveningen.
I won't try it. I'll stick to playing it. And Karpov castled. And out comes the bishop to e7. And the first real sign of aggression from white, pawn to f4. And although there's no immediate threat to use these pawns as a dangerous blunt instrument in the middle of at this stage, and for example, white could play e5, or he could play f5 in the near future. He doesn't want to do this. He wants to store up energy, keep these two pawns on e4 and f4, preparing to use them as a battering ram when the time comes, when the appropriate time comes. And also, you can see quite clearly here that black's committed to castling on the king side. He can never castle queen side in a variation like this. It's too open on the queen side. And when black does castle queen side, white's also considering playing a move like this, g4. And it's often around a move of that sort, g4, that the whole viability of the black defence stands or falls, because g4 can be a crushing move that chases black away and rolls him up like this. But also, don't forget that when white plays a move like g4, there's a whole vacuum of empty squares behind that troika of pawns on e4, f4 and g4, which if black is playing intelligently, perhaps can exploit, and he can sink pieces into those holes and really embarrass white.
Karpov doesn't want to take prisoners.
But, so that f4 by white sets the scene. And of course, Kasparov castles. He must castle. He's got absolutely no choice. His king's definitely going to the king's side. And now comes one of those little grandmaster moves.
Yes, that
King
I referred
H1.
to, yes.
I mean, even I, Donald, I said modestly, don't really understand
Well,
why.
I was going to say, you know, it's funny you should say that, because one or two that we've had in this series, even I could spot. But why on earth has he made that?
Well, I think it's because he wants to play this move, g4, fairly soon, and he wants his king tucked away out of danger as much as possible beforehand. But I admit it's a difficult one to spot. I mean, let's put the king back for a minute. And if I was white, I would seriously consider a move like this. I see nothing wrong with that. But this is a respectable move, and they're still playing according to known paths. King h1. And now Kasparov introduces one of the key themes of the Sicilian defence, the pressure for the black pieces on the half-open c-file. And the queen occupying the c-file already is a good start. And of course, black is considering in times to come playing a move like this, perhaps having the bishop go here, not only gaining space on the queen side, but also attacking the white pawn on e4. And Karpov's having none of that. Bang, he stops it. Now black cannot ever consider playing b5. So he switches plans. Now comes the knight. And finally, white develops the bishop. And Kasparov plays this move, rook to e8. Now
that I'd like to hear more about.
we're really, with this game, we're really in the stratosphere of chess technique and chess ideas. I mean, I think that in all the games we've looked at up to now, the first 11 in the series, I understand what both players are doing more or less all the time. But in this game, there are moves so deep and so subtle.
They're way up there. Yeah.
I am not quite sure what they're for. And I can see, well, yes, it's a useful move. It could come in handy. You know, perhaps he's just making a
bishop
square for the bishop.
Yes.
But why does it go there? Why doesn't it come here, for example? Who knows? I mean, this is one of these super subtle moves that only people like Karpov and
If I was going to
Kasparov
move
understand.
that rook, it would have been to the d because of the queen.
But we're going to see more moves like that in this game. Karpov plays this, bishop to f3, defending his pawn and making space for the queen on the second rank. And Kasparov puts the rook here. This one I understand. He wants to, at some point, play a move like b6, and he doesn't want the rook and the
And
queen
he's
in the
thinking
line.
of that bishop over there.
This one I can sympathise with. Rook b8, I understand that. And the queen goes to d2. And Kasparov connects his rooks. So black has a restricted position. It's a kind of cramped position, but it's a position full of resilience and strength. He can look forward to the middle game with confidence. His position is solid, and any attempt by white to aggress could rebound. And now Karpov plays this move, which contains a threat. The threat is to put the pawn here, and then perhaps sink a bishop into this square, exploiting the hole on the black queen's wing. And Kasparov, of course, forestalls that threat. He plays this, keeping his front very secure. And now, of course, there's no chance for white to play this move. Black simply takes it off. And here it comes, the kamikaze attack. If Karpov wants to win this game, and he must win this game, his whole world title depends on it, at some point he has to play this move. And the threat is to come here, winning the black knight. Kasparov plays this, an extraordinarily deep and subtle move. First of all, he's making a square on d7 for his king's knight, should it be attacked.
Right.
And secondly, now that white's played g4, he wants to relocate this bishop here, looking at the white king.
Yes.
He's already thinking about this vacuum created by the advance of the white pawns, and he wants to sneak in with that bishop in some future stage and have a go at the white king. And remember that, Donald, it comes in very important later on. So bishop to c8. Karpov ploughs on. The knight has to run away. And the queen comes over to f2. We saw this already in the Botvinnik-Capablanca game, the piling up of white pieces, rook on f1, queen on f2, even though the f-file is closed.
Because it's going to open it.
He's going to try and open it up later on. And now Kasparov starts to build a fortress around his king. And believe me, it's necessary. The bishop comes back. And Kasparov aims the bishop at the white king.
The bishop came back there, the white bishop, to clear
Clear the third rank.
Yes, yes.
You'll see what happens. He plays rook to d1.
Yes.
You'll see the point. This is so deep, you know, they're thinking so many moves ahead. And Kasparov continues to construct his fortress around the king. He plays the bishop back to c1. It's a funny kind of move, a retrograde move. You think, why is he doing this in the middle of an attack? What he's trying to do is to bring the rook up to this square and then to transfer it over to here, to the direct proximity of the black king. Let's put the rook back. Bishop c1. And now rook to c8, increasing the latent pressure on this open c file, which is very important for black. Up comes the white rook, and the knight goes in, attacking the rook. Very important. And now the black queen and rook on that file are very usefully placed. The rook comes here.
To h3.
And Kasparov continues the construction of his fortress around the king. Now, at this moment, Karpov kind of loses his nerve. He's been building up an attack very patiently and solidly, but now was the time to strike. And he has two ways of doing this. One is to play the queen here, and the other one is to immediately push the pawn like this, which is really what he's been aiming for.
Yes.
And I think he had to do that. One of these two moves, or a combination of the two. But at this critical moment of the game, when everything is to play for, he plays a safety move. And this safety move is looking at the black pawn on b6. He's thinking about winning that pawn on b6. The queen and bishop line up against it. But in a game like this, where the world title hangs on it, thinking about a pawn on the queen's side is not what should be going on. He should be going for the king. And now Kasparov comes up with this incredibly deep defensive maneuver. He puts a rook here, kind of justifying the rook e8 he played before. And again, Karpov hesitates. He wants to see what Kasparov is doing. And again, I think this is the wrong frame of mind for such a decisive game. It was really, you know, he should have, perhaps even f5 now, pushing the pawn on. And now another extraordinary move, doubling rooks in a totally closed file. There's so many of Kasparov's moves in this game are so difficult to fathom. You know, the rooks, what are they doing? They're in a completely, they're not going anywhere. Why is he doing this? But you see, he's now discouraging white from playing this, because when black takes it off, suddenly this column of rooks that's been allowed to build up would be a devastating force in the middle.
And also there's a possibility of the black pawn to e5.
Or indeed f5, which is what happens. And Kasparov is building up, waiting for this. Karpov plays the rook to d1. He's thinking about weak pawns all the time. But Kasparov doesn't bother about weak pawns. Now he strikes
F5,
back.
yes.
The counter-attack begins. And now you see that all these bunched up pieces storing energy actually start to play a key role in the game. Karpov takes off. And black takes back. White takes f6. The threat is the knight coming to g4. He stops it with rook g3. And now those two rooks come across. First one to f7. Black starting a big counter-attack. And he doesn't bother about the pawn on b6, which white takes. Bishop takes b6. Queen goes to b8. White's now a pawn up. A pawn up. Karpov's happy. You know, he thinks he's going to keep his world title. But he hasn't seen the tremendous dynamic play that black develops. Bishop e3, keeping the bishop safe. Knight to h5, attacking the rook. The rook goes to g4. And now, a beautiful psychological ploy by Kasparov. He puts the knight back on f6. Now, if white plays rook g3, knight h5 again. And we have a draw by repetition.
Yes, that's one thing.
Karpov can't
Yes.
take a draw. He wants to see what Karpov's
right.
going to do.
So he's going to have to come out and get it. Yeah.
So, we go back to the game. Knight to f6. He has no choice. He has to put the rook here, otherwise his title's gone. And now he sacrificed a pawn on the queen side. Kasparov does it on the other wing too. g5. What a wonderful move. All he needs is a draw to win the World Championship. And he's sacrificing pawns all over the board, both sides.
Now, what's in his mind with that one, Ray?
Well, you'll see, because white has no choice. He must take it. But doesn't this remind you of Alekhine? Alekhine's game with Bogolyubov. Kasparov is a student of Alekhine. He admires Alekhine. He said that he loved the way that Alekhine's attacks came like thunderclaps from a clear sky. You know, one moment it's sun shining, wonderful weather, and then boom, a thunderstorm. Everything's hitting you from all directions. And Alekhine used to play in the middle, the centre, the right, the left, all at once. This is what Kasparov's doing. He's playing on all sides of the board at once, utilising the full resources of the board. White must take it. And out comes the knight. Double attack against the white queen from knight and rook. The queen must come here. He captures the bishop. There's absolutely no defence, no alternative. He must take back. And now the knight sitting on b4 for so long jumps in. Knight takes c2. And now at this moment of the game, both players are in raging time trouble. They have to play 40 moves in 2.5 hours each on the time clock. They're both very short of time. This game decides the World Championship. There's almost pandemonium in the playing hall in Moscow. Everyone's so excited. Karpov lashes out. He plays his queen into b6. And Kasparov, still a pawn down, offers the exchange of queens. But white's position is so loose now. Everything is scattered. The rook is scattered over here. The knight is undefended. This knight is very aggressive, the knight on c2. But really black has the advantage. And what Karpov should do now is he should trade queens. He should play queen takes b8. But carried away by the time trouble, the excitement, the momentum, he plays rook takes d6. And now the drama intensifies. Rook to b7, hitting the white queen. The white queen must take on a6. And now, for the first time in this game, Kasparov makes a mistake. And I think it's the only game in the entire series
Because
where
of time trouble, probably.
Yes, that I've included. And this game is so dramatic and so well fought and so representative. I've chosen it anyway. But even in this game, the only game, I say, where the winner actually makes a serious detectable error. He could win more quickly now by playing this move, attacking the white queen. The white queen must move, abandoning the defence of the rook on d6, and the black queen on b8 will take the rook on d6.
Yes.
But short of time, due to this intense sporting pressure, Kasparov didn't stop to think.
Makes it more obvious.
He just grabbed a knight.
Yeah.
It should be good enough as well, but it's not quite as clear-cut. And now Karpov gets another pawn for his piece, rook takes e6. And Kasparov breaks in for the white position. This isn't just a pawn on b2 that's gone. He's trying, as I said before, he's trying to scythe his legions towards the white king and smash the white king as well.
Yes,
really
I wouldn't have been able to resist the knight, you see.
And in desperate time trouble, Karpov sets a trap, queen to c4, threatening checkmate, double checkmate actually.
Yes.
The rook takes e8. And of course, the king sidesteps. And now, Karpov could still have kept the game alive by playing g6. There's still fight left in the position. There's still, even though he's a piece down, the game can go on. But on his 40th move, the last move of the time control, he has to make this one move before his flag falls, and he loses on time. Karpov plays this move. And now the long-awaited black counter-attack against the vacuum around the white king. Queen here, check. Suddenly, black is attacking out of the blue. White's attack's evaporated. The king must go in the corner. Bishop takes g2 check. King takes g2.
Now there are all sorts of possibilities.
He can even win the queen with knight e3 check. But the clearest way is to play knight d4, check from the rook. And in this dramatic moment, Karpov resigned the game and his title. Whatever white does, like for example this move, then he can simply take off the rook. And black is
just
a rook and a piece up.
No matter what. Yes.
And at this moment, when Karpov resigned, the hall broke into complete chaos. People, Kasparov supporters screaming and cheering, Kasparov throwing his hands in the air. I mean, this was probably the most dramatic game ever played in the entire history of chess.
What a dramatic way to resolve the World Championship.
It was indeed.
Poor old Karpov.
Wonderful. But of course their rivalry continued.
Did you ever play Karpov?
I played him 3 times, Donald. Twice I lost, but once I made a draw. Did you ever play Karpov?
Well, I just had the one match against
really?
Karpov. Yes,
You played him too?
one game. That was 1977 in Lucerne. And, well, he was world champion then. In fact, they've got a picture in the studio of the event. And if you look at it, you will see the world champion is not too worried. But the joke of the matter is that if you look at the other side of the story, you'll see that I'm one of 24 players.
So it was a simultaneous display. Well, this game between Karpov and Kasparov wraps up what I think is a terrific 12 programmes,
Great.
fantastic games. I mean, what are the highlights for you? It's not a fair question perhaps, but do you have a particular favourite?
Oh, naturally, I think they were all marvellous, but I think my favourite has to be what I call the Nimzovich strangulation game 7 or 8.
Against Zamish.
Yes, where Zamish just couldn't, no matter what he tried, couldn't break out of that. It was like the boa constrictor. And I think that for sheer creativity was the most astonishing game.
Yes. I mean, I find all the games really wonderful, but the one that I have most enthusiasm for, perhaps because I was getting the moves live as it was played, is this last one between Karpov and Kasparov. I mean, I was actually sitting in London, having the moves phoned through to me as it was played.
With mounting excitement.
With mounting
yes.
excitement, and I was experiencing this tremendous tension, in fact, as the game was being played in Moscow. And I'd been to the match in Moscow already and watched some of the games beforehand in that particular contest. So I had a very close identification with this one. I don't think it's the most perfect game by any means of those played, but...
Well, in the circumstances, if you think of it...
The tension.
Yes,
how do people play under such tension? It's incredible. Yeah. It's fitting anyway that our final game in this series of the 12 best should have been between the 2 greatest active champions of the present day. We have come a long way since the immortal game of London 1851, a game where the victim was outclassed and overwhelmed. The clash between Karpov and Kasparov was, in contrast, the most sophisticated and wide-ranging battle between 2 nearly equal and near-perfect forces, a pointer to the advances to come, perhaps, in chess art and science. We hope you have enjoyed these 12 duels of the mind as much as we have. So it's our final goodbye from Donald, myself, and the entire Thames chess team.
Duels of the Mind was presented in association with Grandmaster Video Magazine.